welcome to Voices in the Dark. Close your eyes now, and let me tell you a story. A story of the sea, and solitude, and something that waited in the dark waters for a very long time. I call it The Lighthouse Keeper's Last Watch. The lighthouse stood on a rocky outcrop 3 miles from shore, a lonely sentinel of white stone that had watched over the harbor for more than 100 years. Its light swept across the black waters every night, a steady rhythm that sailors had come to trust like a heartbeat. And for the past 6 months, that light had been tended by a man named Thomas Whitmore. Thomas had taken the position for the solitude. After his wife had passed, after the funeral in the empty house and the pitying looks from neighbors, he'd wanted nothing more than to be alone with the sea and the silence. The lighthouse seemed like a blessing. For weeks on the rock, 1 week back on shore. For weeks where the only sounds were wind and waves and the turning of the great light above. The lighthouse authority had warned him it could be lonely. They'd told him about the keeper before him, a man named Carver, who'd left abruptly after only 2 months. They said Carver had become paranoid, convinced there was something wrong with the station. But they'd inspected everything thoroughly. The lighthouse was sound. Carver had simply cracked under the isolation. Thomas wasn't worried. He welcomed the isolation like an old friend. For the first 3 months, it was exactly what he needed. He fell into the rhythm of the lighthouse, winding the mechanism that turned the light, maintaining the lamp, checking the weather instruments, recording everything in the logbook. During the day, he read books from the small library in the keeper's quarters. At night, he sat in the watchroom and listened to the sea. It was peaceful. It was perfect. But then, in his 4th month, Thomas began to notice something strange. It started with the radio. The lighthouse had a shortwave radio for emergencies and weekly check-ins with the harbor master. Thomas was meticulous about his radio schedule, always calling in at precisely 9 a.m. every Monday. But one Tuesday morning, he woke to find the radio on, tuned to a frequency that emitted only static. He was certain he'd turned it off the night before. He was certain. He told himself he must have been mistaken. He'd been half asleep, perhaps. These things happened. Then there were the footsteps. The lighthouse had a spiral staircase that wound up from the keeper's quarters at the base to the light room at the top. 147 steps. Thomas had counted them many times. The stairs were iron, and they rang like bells when you climbed them. In the deep silence of the night, you could hear every footfall echoing up and down the tower. Thomas began to hear those footsteps when he was alone in his quarters, trying to sleep. Slow, measured steps ascending the stairs. He would lie in his bed, counting them. 15 steps. 20. 30. Always stopping somewhere in the middle of the tower, never reaching the top, never descending again. The first few times, he went to investigate. He took his flashlight and climbed the stairs, calling out, checking every landing. There was never anyone there. The lighthouse was empty except for him. He checked the doors. They were all locked from the inside. The only entrance was a heavy steel door at the base, secured with a bolt that could only be fastened from within. No one could get in without him knowing. Still, the footsteps continued. Always at night. Always stopping halfway up the tower. Thomas tried to rationalize it. Old buildings made noises. The tower expanded and contracted with temperature changes. The wind could create strange sounds. Metal could ping and groan in ways that mimicked footsteps. He wrote these explanations in his journal, trying to convince himself. But he couldn't explain what happened with the logbook. The lighthouse logbook was kept in the watchroom, just below the light itself. Every keeper was required to make daily entries, weather conditions, sea state, any passing vessels, any maintenance performed. Thomas was diligent about his entries, writing them every evening before his night watch. One morning, he climbed to the watchroom and found his most recent entry crossed out. Not erased, but carefully, methodically scored through with heavy pencil lines. And beneath it, in handwriting that wasn't his own, a single sentence. "He is still here." Thomas stared at those words for a long time. His hands trembled as he touched the page. The handwriting was shaky, almost frantic, as if written in great haste or distress. It wasn't his handwriting. He was alone in the lighthouse. He was certain he was alone. He tore out the page and burned it in his small stove. He didn't report it during his next radio check-in. He didn't want them to think he was cracking, like Carver. He told himself it must have been there all along, that he'd somehow missed it, that perhaps it was an old entry from before his time that had only just become visible somehow. But he knew better. He knew. That night, for the first time, Thomas saw the figure. He was in the watchroom, sitting in the keeper's chair, watching the beam of light sweep across the water. It was just past midnight. The sea was calm, barely a ripple on its surface. The moon was new, and the darkness beyond the light's reach was absolute. And in that darkness, just at the edge where the light faded into black, Thomas saw a man standing on the gallery that circled the outside of the lighthouse. He froze. His breath caught in his throat. The figure was perfectly still, facing outward toward the sea, hands on the railing. In the brief moment the light swept past, Thomas could see he wore an old-fashioned keeper's uniform, dark and heavy. Then the light swept on, and the gallery was empty. Thomas sat rigid in his chair, his heart hammering. He counted the seconds until the light completed its rotation. 12 seconds. The beam swept across the gallery again. The figure was still there. Still motionless. Still staring out at the sea. Thomas stood slowly. His legs felt weak. The gallery door was locked from the inside. He could see the bolt from where he stood. But he walked to it anyway, his hand shaking as he reached for the handle. He had to know. He opened the door. Cold wind rushed in, carrying the smell of salt and seaweed. The gallery was empty. Thomas stepped out onto the metal walkway, circling the lighthouse completely. There was nowhere to hide out here, nowhere anyone could go. The gallery was a simple circle around the light room, with a 3-foot railing and nothing else. Empty. Completely empty. But as Thomas stepped back inside and locked the door, he happened to glance down at the metal floor of the gallery. There, in a thin layer of salt spray and moisture, were footprints. Not his own. He could see where they led from the door, around to the seaward side of the gallery, and then, they simply stopped. As if whoever made them had stepped off into empty air. Thomas didn't sleep that night. He sat in the watchroom, watching the light turn, watching the empty gallery. The figure didn't appear again. But Thomas felt watched. He felt a presence in the lighthouse, something patient and cold that moved through the tower's shadows. In the morning, exhausted and shaken, Thomas decided to search the lighthouse thoroughly. He'd been through it before, of course, but he'd never really looked. There had never been a reason to. He started in the keeper's quarters. The room was simple, a bed, a desk, a stove, some cupboards. But as he moved the bed to sweep beneath it, something caught his eye. There were scratches on the floor, dozens of them, clustered near where the head of the bed usually sat. Deep gouges in the wood, as if someone had dug their fingernails into the floor over and over. In the cupboard, behind some old rope and spare lamp parts, he found a journal. The binding was water-damaged, the pages stained and brittle. He opened it carefully. The handwriting inside matched the entry he'd found in the logbook. It was Keeper Carver's journal. Thomas sat at his desk and read it by lamplight. The entries started normally enough, routine observations, weather notes, the same mundane details Thomas recorded himself. But as the weeks progressed, Carver's writing became increasingly distressed. Heard the footsteps again tonight. Counted them this time. They always stop at the 73rd step. Why always 73? Found the logbook vandalized. Someone is writing in it. Someone who isn't me. The figure on the gallery. I've seen him 3 times now. He never moves. Just stands there, looking out to sea. I called out to him tonight. He didn't turn around. Didn't acknowledge me at all. But when the light swept past again, he was facing me. I didn't see him turn. The light turned, and suddenly he was looking right at me. I know who he is. I found the old records in the basement. His name was Keeper Samuel Thorne. He tended this light for 30 years. They found him on the rocks below the gallery in 1923. They said he jumped. They said the isolation drove him mad. But I don't think he jumped. I think he's still here because he's waiting for something. Or someone. I think he needs to be relieved. I think he's been standing his watch for 100 years, and he doesn't know he can stop. The final entry was barely legible, the handwriting wild and desperate. He spoke to me tonight. Through the gallery door. His voice was like wind through dead reeds. He said, "The watch must be kept. The watch must always be kept. You understand now, don't you? You understand why you can't leave. I'm leaving tomorrow. I don't care what they say. I won't stay here. I won't become like him." Thomas closed the journal slowly. His hands had gone cold. He looked around the keeper's quarters, at the scratches on the floor, at the heavy door with its bolt. Carver had fled. And Thomas was here now, standing the watch that Carver had abandoned. That Keeper Thorne had never stopped standing. He checked his calendar. He had 12 more days before his rotation ended and a new keeper would arrive to relieve him. 12 days. He could last 12 days. He would ignore the footsteps, ignore the figure, ignore whatever presence haunted this tower. He would do his job and leave when his time was up. But that night, everything changed. Thomas was in the watchroom, as always, monitoring the light. It was storming, a proper gale that sent waves crashing against the rocks and rain hammering the windows. The wind howled around the tower like something alive and furious. And through the storm, Thomas heard a voice. It came from everywhere and nowhere, a sound that seemed to bypass his ears entirely and speak directly into his mind. Low and hollow and patient. The watch must be kept. Thomas stood up, his chair scraping across the floor. "Who's there?" "You know who I am. You've seen me. You've read about me. I've been waiting for you, Thomas. Waiting for someone who understands." "Understands what?" Thomas's voice cracked. He was speaking to the empty room, to the air itself. What it means to lose everything. What it means to have nothing left but duty. You came here to escape, Thomas. You came here to be alone with your grief. But grief is a lighthouse of its own. It keeps you fixed in one place. It keeps you turning, always looking back at what you've lost. This isn't real, Thomas whispered. You're not real. I'm as real as your sorrow. I'm as real as the part of you that wants to stay here forever, away from the world that hurt you. I've been here for 100 years, Thomas. The light must be tended. The watch must be kept. They don't understand that. They keep sending people who want to leave. But the lighthouse needs a keeper who will stay. I'm leaving in 12 days, Thomas said firmly. I'm leaving, and I'm not coming back. No. You won't. The light went out. Thomas stood in absolute darkness. The great lamp above him, which should never go dark, which had redundancies and backups and failsafes, was simply out. The mechanism that turned it had stopped. The tower was silent except for the storm. And in that darkness, Thomas heard the footsteps. Coming up the stairs. Not stopping at the 73rd step this time. Continuing. Getting closer. Thomas fumbled for his flashlight, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped it. The beam clicked on, cutting through the darkness. He aimed it at the doorway just as the footsteps reached the watchroom. Keeper Samuel Thorne stood in the doorway. He looked exactly as he had in the old photograph Thomas had found in the basement records. A gaunt man with hollow eyes and weathered skin, wearing a keeper's uniform that was green with age and sea rot. His hands hung at his sides, dripping water onto the floor. And his eyes were like windows into something vast and cold and empty. I can't leave, Keeper Thorne said. His voice was that same hollow whisper. The watch must be kept. And I'm so tired, Thomas. So very tired. 100 years of watching the sea. 100 years of standing in the dark. I need to be relieved. I need someone to take over. No, Thomas backed away, his flashlight shaking. No, I won't. I'm leaving. You can't leave either. Not anymore. Don't you feel it? The lighthouse is you now. It knew you were looking for a place to hide from your pain. It called to you. And now you're here, and you'll stay here, just as I have stayed. The watch must be kept, Thomas. Always. Forever. The figure moved toward him, one slow step at a time. Not walking so much as gliding, its feet barely touching the floor. Thomas backed against the windows, trapped. The storm raged outside, wind screaming. And then Thomas understood. He understood what Keeper Thorne meant. He understood the lighthouse's hunger for keepers who had nowhere else to go, nothing else to live for. He understood that he could spend the next 100 years here, maintaining a light that no one really needed, standing a watch that would never end, slowly becoming like Thorne, a ghost bound by duty and despair. Or he could choose differently. You're right, Thomas said quietly. I came here to escape. To hide. To stop feeling. But that's not living. That's just haunting yourself. He thought of his wife. Not the loss of her, but the love that had been there. The life they'd shared. She wouldn't want him here, trapped in a tower with his grief. She'd want him to heal. To live. I'm sorry for what happened to you, Thomas said to the figure before him. I'm sorry you couldn't leave. But I'm not you. My watch ends in 12 days, and I'm going to walk out that door and go home. You can't, Keeper Thorne began. Yes, I can. Because unlike you, I have something to go back to. Not her. She's gone. But life. The rest of my life. However much there is, whatever it looks like. And I'm not going to spend it standing in the dark. Thomas moved toward the door. Keeper Thorne didn't stop him. The figure simply stood there, and for the first time, Thomas saw something other than emptiness in those hollow eyes. He saw something that might have been relief. Or recognition. "The watch must be kept," Keeper Thorne whispered, but it sounded like a question now. "No," Thomas said gently. "The watch can end. You just have to let it." He walked past the figure, down the stairs, all 147 steps. Behind him, he heard a sound like wind, like breath, like someone finally letting go of something they'd carried for far too long. Thomas reached the keeper's quarters, packed his few belongings, and sat at his desk to wait for morning. The storm was fading. The light above had come back on by itself. He could hear the mechanism turning again, steady and sure. When dawn broke, he radioed the harbor master. He told them he was leaving early, that he couldn't complete his rotation. He told them to find a new keeper, someone better suited to the solitude. He'd be on the supply boat when it came in 3 days. They were understanding, even kind. They asked if he was all right. He said he would be. For those last 3 days, Thomas tended the light faithfully. He made his entries in the logbook, maintained the lamp, watched the sea. But he didn't hear footsteps anymore. He didn't see figures on the gallery. The lighthouse felt different. Lighter, somehow. As if something that had been trapped there for a very long time had finally found its way out. On his last night, Thomas stood in the watchroom one final time, watching the beam sweep across the black water. And in that light, just for a moment, he thought he saw a figure standing on the rocks below the tower. Not the rocks where Keeper Thorne had died, but the smooth ones on the far side, the ones that faced the mainland. The figure was walking away from the lighthouse, toward the distant shore lights. Walking steadily, purposefully, growing smaller and fainter with each step until the light swept past again and the rocks were empty. Thomas smiled. He hoped, wherever Keeper Thorne was going, there would be rest at the end of his journey. Peace. An end to the watch he'd stood for far too long. When the supply boat came, Thomas locked the lighthouse door behind him for the last time. He didn't look back as the boat pulled away from the rocks. He looked forward, toward the harbor, toward home, toward whatever came next. The lighthouse stood behind him, its lights still turning, still sweeping across the sea. But it would need to find another keeper now. Someone else to tend its lamp and stand its watch. Thomas had kept his own watch long enough. It was time to live again. And so the lighthouse stands to this day, on its lonely rock 3 miles from shore. They say it's hard to keep a lighthouse keeper there for long. They say the isolation gets to people. That they hear things. See things. That the tower has a way of holding on to people who don't want to be held. But Thomas Whitmore went home, and he lived the rest of his life on solid ground, among people he loved and people who loved him. And sometimes, on stormy nights, he would look out toward the sea and see the distant pulse of the lighthouse beam, and he would remember. But he never went back. Some watches are meant to end. Let that thought carry you now into sleep. Into dreams where no watch needs to be kept, where no light needs tending, where you are at rest. Sleep well.